Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 12, Section 3 Culture of the Middle Ages. And we're going to talk a little bit about architecture, particularly church architecture. Um, One of the things that we're going to see during the kind of the end of the Middle Ages into the beginning of the Renaissance is that art is going to take on a really important role in everyday life. The purpose of art during the Middle Ages was to show the glory of God. And with new technologies that kind of came out of times like the Crusades and perhaps maybe better um, mathematical skills that were coming out of universities, these giant churches that were built during kind of the end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the Renaissance, really start taking shape. The new Gothic churches, as they were called, because Gothic is kind of the style of architecture that we're talking about here, were different than previous churches because they were taller, they were brighter. They featured this really weird thing called a flying buttress. And if you take a look at the couple of the pictures down below here, flying buttress is kind of like a support to make sure that very high walls won't topple in on themselves. Because this is an era time before the use of steel, the weight that the walls that are being borne upon, um, the foundation and whatnot, um, needed a buttress to kind of support that weight and to take the load off of it. And if you take a look at the churches below here, you can kind of see that. It's kind of like a skeleton on the outside, like an exoskeleton. Today, you could probably use steel to kind of do the same thing that a flying buttress did. But what it allows for are much taller walls. Churches that were once maybe only a few stories tall now can be 5, 6, 7 stories tall and much larger on the inside. It's not going to be kind of a cramped, darkened space. It's going to allow for thinner walls, probably the use of stained glass windows because the walls and the weight can be borne by that buttress. This allows you to be able to have stained glass. Pointed arches inside to allow the ceilings to be higher, and then you have more open interior, which allows for more people to be inside of these churches. One other thing that you might see, kind of along the line of stained glass, is this idea of like the rose window. A rose window is a kind of a circular stained glass window. We have one at St. Francis and Humphrey, and I think there's a smaller one in St. Leonard's and Madison. But it's kind of a unique style of making glass, just for the sake that, kind of all the pieces kind of go together to make that circular design. And nevertheless, the whole idea of storytelling kind of gets amped up when we talk about the use of stained glass, as far as being able to depict scenes out of the New Testament or scenes from the lives of the saints. It becomes really a work of art. Okay. One other thing that you might notice, and particularly in the bottom picture in the center here, are the spears or the spires, if you want to call it, or a steeple. This idea that that spire is directing your eyes upwards towards heaven, and kind of, in a way, uh, kind of re-emphasizing, the whole purpose of religion is to kind of get to heaven. So the difference between the old Romanesque architecture that was kind of known at the beginning of the Middle Ages, and then what's going to happen at the end with the Gothic architecture, kind of at the end of the Middle Ages to beginning of the Renaissance, is kind of boiling down to a few things. Romanesque design, churches were built in what we would call the basilica shape, which is kind of more of a formal kind of setting where you have wings of the church. You might have a place there for if you have like a number of religious sisters to sit, maybe a place for monks to sit, so that they're not sitting with the rest of the parishioners. There are very thick walls, meaning that because you don't have flying buttresses, the weight of the walls has to be borne by the wall itself. And thus, it's not uncommon to find a church that has walls that are about 3 foot thick, if not more. Along with that, you have very few windows. Part of that is, again, the engineering, the walls itself. It just doesn't lend itself to the use of windows. So if you take a look at, a Gothic design, the church that's kind of at the top here is kind of more of that. I mean, it's, for the time, probably appeared to be very tall, but in comparison to what we're going to see with the Gothic churches, maybe not as tall. The walls, look very sturdy, but on the inside, there's not a lot of interior space. So things are really cramped. Okay, the Gothic design, you have red vaults, you've got pointed arches. This allows for the roof or the ceiling to be supported, um, but it also opens everything up a little bit, so you have very high ceilings and kind of an open interior. You have the use of the flying buttress, which takes the weight off the wall and puts it onto the buttress. This allows for much higher walls that come out of this. And again, the use of large stained glass windows are going to become very, very common. So, one particular medieval slash Gothic church that probably has gotten a little more notoriety in the last several years is the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. And if you remember back a few years ago, there was a really bad fire when they were doing some extensive renovations, and they almost lost the entire church. Matter of fact, if you take a look at the bottom picture there, that spire that you see kind of in the middle of the church toppled onto itself. And the roof that you see there that's kind of looking kind of whitish, that is a lead roof. And so when this fire was going, when it was raging, literally the roof was melting. And so when the fire was eventually extinguished, there was a desire to rebuild, but to rebuild maybe back stylistically the same way that the church was built back in the late Middle Ages. And so rather than using steel, they had to go out and harvest large timbers of oak to go back and to build the rafters that were destroyed by the fire. They had to use lead again so that they could have their kind of the same roofing. But nevertheless, we're just a very short time away from the cathedral reopening. And there's a pretty good chance that in the next several months we're going to hear a lot more about the triumph here of what they were able to save and how this was really kind of a really triumph, so to speak. So, other things that were happening maybe on the lines of culture and art and such. Within new universities, subjects such as Roman law and Greek philosophies of guys like Aristotle were being taught, along with Islamic writings were also being taught as well. Um, this is to broaden the education of scholars during this period of time. Along with this, theology was a very important subject taught in universities. It was influenced by very, very smart people through the use of scholasticism, which was the belief that faith could be in harmony with reason. And St. Thomas Aquinas was one of these guys who kind of was able to tap into this idea of scholasticism. He believed that it could change the way you think. He also was able to combine Christian faith with the rational thought that was coming out of the philosophies of like the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. He also began the study of classical works. So within, some of Aquinas's writings, he talks a lot about Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and in a sense, it kind of combines, you know, the what might seem more secular with the religious thought. Scholasticism emphasized reason as represented by classical philosophy and faith as represented by the Bible, and tried to reconcile the two. So, culture of the Middle Ages, architecture wise, you have a new style. You have Gothic that becomes kind of the kind of the thing. One thing that we didn't mention is a lot of these old Gothic cathedrals use gargoyles, which were basically mason created um, creatures that were used to scare off birds and bats and such, which kind of appear kind of cool. The American Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Has some of the style that's kind of been included in its architecture. And if my memory serves me correct, there is a gargoyle that kind of looks very, very similar to 1970s Star Wars characters of Darth Vader. Part of that being the fact that the cathedral in DC was still being kind of built during the 1970s and 80s, and so it kind of stole some of these pop culture elements into its classical design. This also included technical innovations like the flying buttresses, the ribbed vaults, the pointed arches. When we talk about universities, theology, again, being a very important subject that's going to be taught. The influence on scholasticism, which is trying to bring faith together with reason and put it in harmony. And then one thing that we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about is this idea of the vernacular of literature. The word vernacular basically means the language of the people. And what we're starting to see in the late part of the Middle Ages is that writers are going to write from maybe their own language rather than like the classical languages like Latin and Greek. And this is going to change a lot of things. Every language used to write literature has its vernacular. Um, Sir Roger Bacon, who was a very well known individual, wrote an encyclopedia supporting the reformation of all sciences. You had troubadours who were kind of like traveling musicians. They were poets. They would sing. They would recite poetry. They would entertain people. And this is kind of like one of the first forms of traveling entertainment that you would see. There were heroic epics. So if you talk about Gregory Chaucer and Canterbury Tales, that kind of comes out of this era of time as well. Thank you very much.